To pattern the shield, I looked at reference photos and then built my design on Inkscape. Now I'm going to take the pattern and transfer it to 10mm EVA foam. This part will become the front of the shield. To keep the pattern intact, use silk pins. This will stop the pattern moving about when you're drawing around it. Now you can draw around the pattern. To transfer all the details from the pattern, take a pen and add dots along those lines. This will leave an imprint into the foam underneath, and when you lift this off, it'll be a case of joining the dots and then you'll have your pattern. I would transfer the middle circle and where the planks are, so there's about 6 planks on the shield. I just added dots to either side and then joined those up. You can add in all these triangular details here. Some of the details I transferred over and then realised because I was dremeling I actually lost those details and had to add them again, so you can keep that in mind. Use a metallic pen to join up the dots. Now I'm joining up the dots for the planks. Once you're ready, you can then cut it out with a Stanley blade. Make sure the blade is sharp and you are cutting at 90 degrees whilst continuously turning the foam. Now you have a basic shield shape. Now take the Stanley blade and just score these lines where the planks are. You're not cutting all the way through, you're just scoring them enough so you can determine that these are actually planks that are separate from each other. Now open those lines more by adding heat with a heat gun. Now it looks like it is made up of planks. This is where most of the work comes in, and it's dremeling. So obviously the front of Lagertha's shield has been through the wars. There's a lot of little slithers of wood missing there, so you can recreate that look with the Dremel. You can see I'm focusing on different planks at a time. If you look at the photos, you can see some planks look more weathered than others, so I'm keeping that in mind when I'm doing this. I'm always going left to right here. That's because the wood grain would be going this way. My main aim at the start is just to really get a lot of that material removed, and then once I've done that I can go in and refine a lot of it. So you can see I'm starting to go in and just add some deeper areas. This part of the shield especially looked really worn, so I try to focus a lot of energy there and remove more material. You can see how deep I've actually gone at some of the parts. You just really have to have a lot of patience at this step. I'm obviously deepening that piece of wood, but I'm being careful not to go onto the next plank because I think it's more believable if one part's really weathered and one part isn't. That's just how it looks. So now we're working on the back and we're doing the exact same thing with the pattern, pinning it to the foam, except this time the foam is 5mm. I chose 5 because I didn't want the shield to be too thick. Draw around it with a metallic pen, transfer over the centre of the pattern, transfer over where the planks sit, take it off, and then you can draw in over all those details. Cut it out in the same way with a Stanley blade. I would continuously turn the pattern to make it easier for you, and you can go and work in all those planks now. Score in the lines, and then you can open them with a heat gun to make them stand out. Now remove the centre of the back piece. To make the centrepiece for the shield, I decided to use Worbla. This was to give it a bit of structure, and I know it didn't have to look perfect, so I covered an acrylic dome with Vaseline to stop it sticking, heated up the Worbla and shaped it around it. I then cut out the Worbla and refined the bottom. I wanted this to look really battle worn, so what I did was I covered it in foam, so this is just a 1mm piece of EVA foam, and the reason I've decided to glue that on top is because I'm going to add foam clay, and foam clay sticks well to foam. So it made sense for me to glue this on the top and then add the foam clay. You can see I shaped it in a similar way to the Worbla, over the dome with some heat. Join those together with contact cement, cut off any excess. I also want to make a base that goes around this to match the pattern. So take some Worbla, draw the circle in, draw another circle around that, maybe about 1 inch apart, and remove the middle with some scissors. When removing this part, leave some extra material inside that can be used to make tabs to stick it to the main dome, and then it should fit the middle like this. This will be going in the centre. Now I'm going to connect these pieces, so I cut little indents up to the circle, and then all I do is push those tabs up underneath. This will join the two pieces. Try not to overheat the dome too much, as we don't want to misshape it. Next, I'm doing something similar as before, so I'm taking some scrap foam and just gluing it around the sides. It doesn't matter about this being neat because we're putting foam clay over the top. Once you've glued that on, remove the excess around the Worbla with some scissors. And you'll end up with something like this. Foam clay sticks a lot better with water, so I add some water to my foam surface. I then just move some foam clay around the area. Stab it a bit to make it look a bit more hammered. And if any parts look a bit too rough, I'm just using my hands to smooth it out. To make sure I'm not losing the shape of that centre part, I use a wooden sculpting tool to go around it. The reason I've added foam clay instead of dremeling a piece of foam is because it was really bashed looking and I wanted the look to be as uneven as possible with lots of different shapes and dents appearing in the top. Now leave that to set and then you can cut any excess. To make the handle, I'm using PVC pipe. With PVC pipe you can actually heat it up and shape it. So I heat up the end and then use another piece of PVC pipe to squish it down. I keep heating until I'm happy with that part. I basically want this part to be 2 to 3 inches long so it can sit flat against the back. Just make sure that either side looks the same. Now we're going to drill 2 holes through this part. So find a centre line here, add 2 holes, and then you want to take a drill and drill through. The size of the hole that you're drilling highly depends on how you're connecting the handle to the foam. I'm using Chicago screws, so I made sure I knew the diameter and then I drilled the hole. Repeat this on the other side so they're spaced exactly the same way apart. Now I obviously designed the shield to have a front and a back part. There were 2 reasons for this. Basically I wanted a 15mm thickness and I also wanted to add in Worbla between the two, with the Worbla acting as structure. So before you do this I recommend adding on a centre line to these front and back parts. This is going from the bottom to the top. Just be aware of where the planks are. They should be perpendicular to that line. I add this to the front and the back of it. So I take these Worbla strips I've made, they're a couple of inches wide, and I'm making sure the first 2 go where that centre line is. These strips are where the handle will be screwed. So we need to make sure the middle of the strips match up with the centre line of the shield. You can then draw around them as a guide for gluing. Once ready, glue these together. Add contact cement to the foam and contact cement to the Worbla. When you're adding the diagonal pieces of Worbla, just make sure they're spaced evenly apart. And then you can glue those on. You should end up with 6 pieces of Worbla spaced evenly apart. Now we're going to add the front to the back, so you need to add a lot of contact cement here to either side. Make sure you cover both in their entirety, you don't want any parts that are not glued down properly. To assist you in gluing these together you can use some baking paper. The baking paper stops the contact cement sticking to itself, so it means you can work on one area at a time and then slowly move it until you've glued the entire thing. The most important thing here is that the edges match up and the centre lines match up. Now I actually forgot to remove the centre first, so I'm just removing that now. I would recommend removing that before you glue these together. So I've transferred some of the details to Worbla from the pattern. These are the Worbla triangles. Just draw around where they need to be. Just be aware I had to actually remove these when I added in the screws for the handle, so maybe hold off on these details until you've done that. Obviously I've dremeled the whole thing, so I actually add in some foam clay to give a flat platform to glue this to. You can obviously just not dremel that part at the start. Once that foam clay is set, I then just sand the edges so it's not visible. To glue this down, I add contact cement to the foam clay and contact cement to the Worbla. Once ready, I can join these together. And then if there's any more foam clay sticking out, I can just remove that with some rough sandpaper. Now we're going to add a border around the entire shield, so you'll need a really long piece of foam. It's likely you'll need to do this in 2 parts. To work out how much foam you need, you can use a circumference equals 2πr equation. You can use the circle on my pattern as a guide and you want to mark out where that piece stops. What to do before you start gluing this is you can work out where the centre of these strips are and mark 2 lines to show where the width of the shield is. This means when you're rolling it on you'll see exactly where the shields should go. Add some contact cement to both surfaces and then you want to join them up. Now just roll the shield onto the foam using the 2 lines as a guide. You can then glue on the second piece if required. Now when you're gluing this foam down, what you want to do is push it forward each time. It will create a slight rippling effect, but you can smooth it out a bit. If you just continuously push it forward, then you won't get any huge ripples in the foam. Now you can turn the shield over and repeat on the back. When you've done that, you can remove any excess with a Stanley blade. So once that was on, I decided to again add some foam clay. This is for the look that I wanted. You can obviously skip the foam clay over the whole thing and you can make the rivets just with the foam clay on its own if you want. I just sculpted all of these rivets by hand because they did look like they'd kind of been worn quite a bit. They all looked kind of different in the photo I saw. So I wanted to retain that look. So once all the foam clay was set, I then went back to the handle, and so to transfer the holes through, I use a soldering iron. This will create a small hole in the foam. Just make sure those holes are lined up with the centre line. Once you've made the holes, you can take the handle off and deepen the holes with the soldering iron. If they're not going all the way to the other side, I personally just used a scribe and poked through the hole so I could see it on the other side through the Worbla. And then I could then go through those markings with the soldering iron on the other side, knowing that that's where the hole stops. To join this handle to the shield, I can then use the Chicago screws and screw them in. The screws go through 2 pieces of foam and 1 sheet of Worbla, and I feel like the Worbla is what makes sure that's secure and it won't come out. You can see I removed the triangular Worbla details as I realised the screws weren't long enough. Once the screws were on, I glued these details back on. You can see I've also added some rivets to those triangles. All I did was get some scrap Worbla and mould the shape myself, making sure they're spaced the same way on either side. Now I glue in the centre piece, making sure it's in the centre, and also the Worbla details from the pattern. I wanted to disguise the handle ends, so I designed this piece to go around it. So I add contact cement to these 2 parts, glue them together, make sure it fits, and then Dremel the edges to clean it up. And Dremel further to round those edges at the top. I then go in with some smooth sandpaper to get it looking a bit neater. Now it's ready to glue, so I add contact cement to the shield, contact cement to this part, and glue them together. I then use some foam clay again to add some rivets to these parts, making sure they're spaced the same way on either side. Just make sure you use some water to help it stick. Now we want to clean any contact cement that's visible on the shield. To do this, I use adhesive cleaner. Before we start priming, we want to heat seal the foam. This closes any open cells in the foam. To prime this, I'm using Flex Bond, mixed with a little bit of water. I like using Flex Bond because it's obviously very flexible and it retains detail really well. There's a lot of detail on the shield and I wanted to keep that. I added 3 coats of the Flex Bond spaced about an hour apart. On the first day, I left that to set, and on the second day I did the back in 3 coats spaced an hour apart. The first colour I'm using here is for all the metal parts, and I'm using a colour called Burnt Iron. I use my spray gun and just spray that evenly over all the metal parts. Don't worry if this goes onto the shield because we'll be painting over it. Once the first side is dry, turn it over and do the back, then leave that to dry. Next, I take some blue, green and white paint and mix it to get this kind of bluey aqua colour, and I paint that over the whole of the front. If you think about the way the Vikings would have painted this shield, I'm not too worried about it being really neat. So I'm just kind of sloshing it on. I don't want it to look even, I want to see some of these dark areas coming through. Slowly go around all the metal parts until you've kind of covered that. You can see I wasn't entirely happy with the colour at the start. I actually added in some white here and then eventually more green. Once I was happy with that colour, I left it to dry. It actually needs to be completely dry to be able to do this next step. Then I take some watery black acrylic and spread it all over the shield. Do this in sections to avoid the paint drying and wipe away with a piece of kitchen roll. When you do this, the black kind of sticks to all those deeper points and it gives a slight worn look to those higher parts. You can experiment with different ratios of the black acrylic to water. Sometimes it works better to have it slightly thicker and sometimes it works to have it a bit more watery. I kind of did a mix of everything for this. I also recommend going around the outside of the shield, just where that surround is. This part would naturally be a lot darker with wear. I actually also put some paint on a bit of kitchen roll and patted this over the shield to create dirt spots. So once you're happy, you can then go and weather the metal parts. I did exactly the same thing. So you get your black acrylic paint and mix it with water and use the kitchen roll to wipe it, leaving a residue. This will just make the metal look a bit aged and worn, like it's been heavily used. I don't even mind if there's little bits of residue left on the metal, because it might look like there's dirt that's just dried that way and looks a bit more matte. You can also go in with some other shades if you want. I added just a little bit of brown to some areas. Now I'm adding the emblem to the front of the shield. Just make sure it's the right way round when you do this. I actually cut out these areas on the pattern as a guide, and all I did was take my black paint and go inside these lines. I didn't take it right up to the edge. I left about a 5mm gap so that I could tidy it up when I take this off. I do this for all 4 diagonals, and then I know those other ones are at the bottom and the top, so I know where they sit. I go in and fill any gaps that are missing. I roughly fill in these bottom and top parts. And then to tidy everything up, what I do is I grab a bit of card and just use that as a straight edge. I didn't want to use any masking tape or frog tape or anything like that because there's so many ridges that I've dremeled, and I didn't know how the tape would handle that because it's an uneven surface. And I felt like using a bit of card, it's quite sturdy, and I felt like this worked out really well for me. Just ensure you're wiping the card edges in between, otherwise you risk rubbing black paint on areas where you don't want it. Once you've done that, you can then paint the back. To explain about the back, I didn't actually film this because I did it last minute. You can obviously paint it out how you want. I think in the show it's actually quite basic, but I made mine's a bit more extreme. So you'll see in a moment how mine's looks. Yeah, so I will try and make a tutorial, particularly how to get this look, but I basically smeared lots of different brown colours left to right and darkened in lots of areas with black paint. So now I'm adding a handle cover. This is the same pair of faux suede trousers I used for the outside of the scabbard. I cut a piece off and covered it with contact cement. I sanded the metal handle and added contact cement to that too, then wrapped the material around it. The main thing here is to ensure it looks neat at the ends and try to avoid having the contact cement sticking to itself when you are wrapping round. Go in at the end with some black acrylic airbrush paint to make it look a bit more worn. Now that's Lagertha's shield complete. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe for more tutorials.